Hello, Mentioners, and welcome to another episode of the Mentionable Podcast. I'm Joel Furchess.
And I'm Chad Gross.
Today on the Mentionables, apologetics and preaching. Shall the twain never meet? Also, aliens! Chad, how's your summer going?
My summer is going very well, and I'm happy to report that I have had no extraterrestrial run-ins.
Man, wish I could say the same.
Joel, have you had a few run-ins with extraterrestrials?
No, it's just my summer isn't going as well. But no, I'm 0-1 for the extraterrestrial run-ins.
Oh, excellent. Well, I'm sorry to hear your summer isn't going so well. Why is that?
I kid. My summer's fine.
All right. I thought maybe it was because of Donald Trump's summit with the Russians.
I would like to keep this podcast as far from politics as I possibly can. I get quite enough of that on Facebook.
Fair point. I'm sorry I went there, folks.
Well, Chad, since you started last time, I'll kick this off and you'll close us out. Copacetic?
Sounds excellent. Looking forward to it.
My topic today, aliens. Now, Tyler and I did a piece on aliens in a previous podcast. We discussed this occasional atheist contention that the existence of aliens would somehow be proof against the existence of God. You've heard this one, Chad?
Yeah, absolutely. I've always found that since becoming a Christian, a little strange, actually, that people give so much credence to this objection, this idea that aliens somehow would disprove Christianity. It's kind of on my list of objections that I think, wow, I'm surprised people think that has so much power to it. And the idea that somehow if extraterrestrial life landed here, that Christianity all of a sudden would be false is just, it's interesting, but I don't think that, I think it's a non sequitur. What do you think, Joel?
Well, let me just kind of boil the argument down for the listeners who hadn't heard the Tyler episode. So basically, it's this idea that Christians believe they are a special creation of God, right? And for whatever reason, if atheists making this argument is sophisticated enough, they may bring this idea that the sin of humans has corrupted not just humans, not just Earth, but the entirety of creation, a la Romans 8:22. This verse says, quote, "For we know that the whole of creation has grown together in the pains of childbirth until now." Note it says the whole of creation. So the question goes, why should alien races have to suffer because of human sin? Or would God have to incarnate on every planet and play out the salvation story over and over? Do Christians need to send missionaries to the stars to evangelize the little green men? That whole dealie. So my response to the argument in brief, and this is what I said on the Tyler episode, is that the existence of intelligent moral agents outside of humanity doesn't really hurt Christianity because the Bible already allows for moral agents outside of humans. They're called angels. And if we can allow for angels, we can allow for aliens. But today I want to talk about another issue related to aliens, one that actually argues for a theistic universe rather than against it. I'll set this up by referencing an episode of Unbelievable from a while back. This was a discussion between astrophysicist David Wilkinson and astronomer Mark Kidger. I kid you not. On this episode, they talked about several things, one of which was how to discover the discovery of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe would impact Christian belief. They started discussing what life elsewhere might be like. So they both agreed that it would probably be almost unrecognizable to human beings. Life forms elsewhere may not be carbon-based or would possibly communicate in ways other than sound. It may look more like mineral than biological. They talked about the likelihood that much life in the universe may be primitive microbes or basic, unremarkable organisms. Others might be millions of years more evolved and advanced than humans. The basic idea is that if life arose in an environment that didn't look like Earth, they wouldn't look like Earthlings. Heck, there are all kinds of life forms here on Earth that don't look like humans, right, Chad?
Yes, very true. I've seen some of them out in public.
like street epistemologists.
Oh, wait, that's not what you meant, was it? You meant like animals and creatures such as that. My fault. My bad.
Right. All right. I want to address this idea of alien intelligence. That's the point I want to make today. To do so, I'm going to return to a guy we talked about in a previous podcast. I don't mean you and me talked about it in that other podcast. In that episode, I was chatting with one of our network members. This guy was a horror author named H.P. Lovecraft, the guy we were talking about, not the network member. I'm bringing up Lovecraft again because,
wow.
Yeah. Have you heard of Lovecraft, Chad?
I confess that I have not, Joel.
All right. Well, I won't go into that whole deal. I'll just kind of sum up. I'm talking about Lovecraft in this episode because the guy had a real imagination when it came to creating aliens. So most sci-fi has aliens looking pretty much like humans with weird skin or pointy ears or something. No matter how weird they look, they usually have eyes and ears and a mouth and bilateral symmetry and manipulative appendages and so forth. Now, Lovecraft fiddled with creatures who had totally unique sensory organs and quadrilateral symmetry or no symmetry at all. Basically, they looked truly alien, not just weird humans. But it wasn't just appearance that made them alien. Let's talk about his most famous creation, a creature called Cthulhu. The really alien thing about Cthulhu was its mind. So Cthulhu was in this death-like stasis, but its mind was transmitting its dreams to the sensitive psyches of artists and poets and writers and creative types all over the world. And the result of contact with its really alien mind was insanity. So it was so alien, human mind couldn't cope with it. Now, Cthulhu was supposed to awake at some point in the future and rise up and take over the planet or something. You know, typical sci-fi stuff. Here's what the story said about it. I quote, "The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves. And all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom." End quote. So this seems really insightful for me from sort of an ontological and presuppositional point, because I think Lovecraft had a real point there when he talks about this alien mind and the way that it would change the human perception. You follow me here, Chad?
Yeah. I think I'm picking up on where you're going with that. I'm anxious to hear you continue.
Okay. The really insightful thing that Lovecraft is getting to here in this quote is what makes us human. We think that and act in a very particular way. We have a shared sense of morality. But would aliens, true inhuman creatures, think and act in the same way we do? And if we encountered one another, would we even be able to cope with or recognize the kind of intelligence and morality we're dealing with? So when questions of alien life come up, we ask, are humans alone in the universe, right? This question says a lot about our mindset. It's not just any life form we're looking for. We've got plenty of inhuman life forms right here on Earth, as we talked about, and yet we still think we're alone, right? Animals just don't cut the mustard. We're looking for something that thinks and acts like us. So you've heard of SETI, right, Chad?
Of course I've heard of SETI. Yeah, that is a fascinating program that still is pouring a good bit of money into that. We are. And basically it is the search for intelligent life.
Yeah. I mean, SETI stands for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So we're not searching for extraterrestrial life. We're searching for extraterrestrial intelligence. This is a search for life forms that share some kind of essential quality found so far only in human beings. That is, intelligence. So here's the question. What defines intelligence?
Right.
What do you think, Chad?
Well, I was going to say, just going back to that before talking about what defines intelligence, I was going to say that what's interesting about SETI is that I know I have read that one of the ways that they would accept that we have found intelligent life is that if they got a list of prime numbers, for example, that were in order. And so I think that is very fascinating when you, and I don't want to go on a rabbit trail here, but it's very fascinating when you think about the code in DNA and how you've got this code in DNA that is far more sophisticated than, a list of prime numbers in order, but yet people would argue that would be sufficient to say that, yes, there's intelligence, but yet it's not sufficient when it comes to DNA. Secondly, obviously, I think that if something is intelligent, and listeners, Joel didn't prep me for this question, so I'm spitballing here. I would say that it is a rational being able to reason with some type of morality and able to do high-level thinking. Something that is intelligent is able to think about their own thinking. They're actually able to reflect on their thinking. And so those would be some things I would look for if I was qualifying something as intelligent versus non-intelligent life. So, for example, my dog, as smart as I think he doesn't sit around thinking about his thinking. That kind of is one of the things that separates us from, the beast, if you will. And so I think those are a few things that I would at least look for if I was trying to have some parameters to identify intelligent life.
Yeah, well, I'm actually
what do you think, Joel?
Really happy that you brought up the intelligent design, because I wasn't prepped to talk about that, but that really ties back into what we're talking about. So I'd love to have that conversation with you. Let me finish my thoughts on the extraterrestrial intelligence, and then let's chat some intelligent design, because you're right. This is kind of a double standard here. We'll look for intelligent life if it shares certain qualities, but then we dismiss intelligent design right off the bat. So, yeah, I like that.
Excellent. Well, let's hear where you're going with this. I think I know, but go ahead.
All right. So, Chad, you're a teacher. Have you heard of this guy, Howard Gardner?
Howard Gardner. I cannot say I've heard of Howard Gardner.
Okay. Well, Gardner was the psychologist that said the way we understand intelligence was pretty narrow. He thought there were all kinds of intelligences represented in people. And he came up with a total of 7 kinds of intelligence. Now, the reason that this ties back into teaching is that in modern teaching theory, they've taken the work of Gardner and they've tried to change teaching techniques to reflect this idea that you're teaching to this wide diversity of intelligences and learning styles in the classroom. So you have to, generalize or craft your teaching in such a way that it reaches all these different learning styles. You've probably heard that part at least, right?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay. So his 7 types of intelligence included language, logical mathematical analysis, spatial representation, musical thinking, the use of the body to solve problems or to make things, an understanding of other individuals, and an understanding of ourselves. So how many of these aspects would an alien being have to share with a human in order to be categorized as intelligent in the same way that we are? We ultimately couldn't know, but they won't relate to us in language, musical thinking, or empathy. At least they won't relate to us empathetically. When SETI looks for intelligent life, they're basically just searching for patterns. Because, and you mentioned the prime numbers, that would be a pattern, a very specific type of pattern that you see not reflected just generally in nature. It has to take somebody that knows a little bit of something from math and can then deduce from that to get prime numbers. Because, ultimately humans communicate through repeated and defined patterns. That's how our language flows, and the universe is defined through mathematics. The universal language, right? So we're talking about SETI. SETI's been around since the 60s. And in 1967, SETI found what we call pulsars. which are basically binary stars that emit a pattern of radio pulses as they orbit one another. So one will pass in front of the other, and as it comes out the end, the radio signal will change and kind of pulse. So when they first discovered the pulsars, they didn't see the stars. They're listening to a radio. They're not seeing them through a telescope. And so they just get these pulses in irregular intervals. And, you can't help but think, what could that be? I'll quote the guy who discovered pulsars. He says, quote, "We did not really believe that we had picked up signals from another civilization, but obviously the idea had crossed our minds, and we had no proof that it was an entirely natural radio emission. It is an interesting problem. If one thinks one may have detected life elsewhere in the universe, how does one announce the results responsibly?" End quote. Okay, so the fact that they were picking up regular, patterned, and consistent radio pulses immediately brought to mind the concept of intelligent communication, right? The universe is structured in a logical and mathematically definable way. That's how we see it anyway, and any life form that successfully evolves within the universe will think, behave, and communicate in logical ways in order to survive and adapt, regardless of their chemical makeup, location, language, or body plan. Of course, behaving and communicating in a patterned, logical, spatially representative ways doesn't quite meet the robust standards humans have for sentient intelligence. So like honeybees, they behave and communicate in these patterned ways. You've heard of this dance that honeybees will do to communicate the location of flowers to other honeybees in the hive, which is really impressive, but you won't sit down and have a conversation with a bee. Obviously bees aren't intelligent in the way that humans are. When they were talking about the conversation that Kidger and Wilkinson had on Unbelievable that I referenced, they brought forth this fact that humans are helplessly prone to anthropomorphize everything around them, meaning that they try to make things look and sound human. So, you got children's books, half the characters are animals that are walking around essentially doing people things. That's anthropomorphizing. And, we do that to everything. We see shapes in the clouds, we see faces in wood patterns, just what people do. If the universe truly is the result of a random, undesigned expansion of space and time, coupled with random chemical reactions sufficiently complex to create walking, talking, thinking flesh bags, then humans will ultimately be stymied in their search for someone in the sky to talk with. Circumstances would have to gift the alien visitors with body plans, sensory capabilities, and perception of identity very close to those of a human, if any common ground were to be had. Otherwise, they would just be another animal for humans to observe and catalog. So let's talk about The Lord of the Flies for a minute. You know this book, Chad?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
All right, well, so the book basically tells the story of a group of British school kids stranded on a desert island. And as they struggle to survive and maintain some kind of order or civilization, they quickly devolved into superstition and predatory behavior towards the wild pigs on the island, but also towards each other. Then, after they are finally rescued, the British naval officer who discovers them is just shocked at their degraded, primitive, and animalistic state. He says that he would have expected a better show from British children. Now, I'm referencing this book because the illustration in that it's true. When humans degrade to this might makes right way of behaving and start preying on each other, we call them animals. That guy walked in and killed a bunch of people. That man is an animal. That whole deal. So it's worth considering that consciously or unconsciously, for something to meet the human standard of intelligence, people would expect it to behave in a very particular way. It would have to have a sense of I and of you. It would have to identify that I and you are equal in terms of how we are to be treated. It's this whole, golden rule deal. Do to others as you would have them do to you. In other words, the alien would also have to be a person, and I'm using person in the technical sense, not a human being, but a person. Far from being, like, as Lovecraft put it, quote, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside. Humans find that laws and morals are the very thing they use to define the intelligence they're looking for. So sometimes the search through outer space is framed as the search for, quote, alien civilizations. A civilization is more than a mere capacity to build dwelling structures. I mean, ants, termites, and bees do this quite effectively. A civilization is the ability to be civil. The impact that discovering extraterrestrial life might have on religion and the nature of this life itself are entirely hypothetical. It would be improper without any evidence of such life existing to use it as the hypothetical existence of the intelligence as an argument against the existence of God, as Lawrence Krauss tried to do in his September 21st, 2013 discussion with John Lennox on Unbelievable. It is, however, fascinating to examine what the idea of intelligence truly entails, and how, when considered, self-awareness and mutual respect are so closely bound up in what humans expect from intelligence. So how does all this relate to God? You seeing this connection, Chad?
Well, yeah, and I think what's fascinating, Joel, about what you're sharing is that it seems to me, if I were to kind of sum up what you're saying, is that because of the type of universe that we find ourselves in, that number one, there are certain parameters, if you will, that a creature would have to evolve within, and so we can have some type of idea of the type of creature that we would get. Am I following you there?
Yeah. No, I mean, we start with this assumption of what kind of life form we'd be expecting to see and what kind of behavior we'd expect to see for it to be intelligent. So, I mean, again, these guys talking on Unbelievable, they're talking about how it would look a whole lot different, but at some basic level, it would be a person as we understand it. You were talking about metacognition, the ability to think about your thoughts. And, I mean, this is the kind of thing they'd be looking for in some weird bug somewhere that otherwise doesn't look human.
Right. And so I guess what I'm thinking, of course, in regard to this is if we have this, imagine we have this extraterrestrial creature, if you will, and the extraterrestrial creature meets these criteria for being what we would call an intelligent being, well then, of course, I think that we need to kind of start to ask the question, where did this ability to reason come from? Is there an origin? Is that solely evolutionary? Or is there a source beyond that?
Yeah,
is that something like where you're going?
Because, if we were to find a ton of life forms all across the universe and they all did more or less think and behave like we did, I could easily see that circling back around to an intelligent design type argument. But then, of course, you'd have the other side saying, well, that's just what evolution does. Every single time, evolution ends up the same way with the same kind of mind that it creates in people's brains.
Right, and I guess that would be the onus of proof there would, I guess, be on the person claiming that, because it seems to me that that's a bold claim to try to say, because Stephen Jay Gould, for example, he himself said, here on Earth, if you could rewind the tape of evolution, rewind the tape of evolutionary history and then play it back again, that we would get very different types of creatures potentially than what we are now. And so I guess it would be onus, it seems to me that it would be a tough road to hoe to say that, oh yeah, no matter where creatures, intelligent beings, intelligent persons evolve, they just happen to have this ability to reason. That seems very implausible to me.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, the rise of intelligence and of self-awareness is just inexplicable in some sense. I mean, Ben Watkins actually sent the Mentionables a question of the week at one point saying, basically define consciousness. What is consciousness? So here's an atheist who's still like blown away by this whole idea of consciousness and how we can't really even nail down what it is, much less how our brain gets it.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I think our ability to reason, our conscience, are very hard to explain by naturalistic means, especially when you're starting with just naturalistic things. And obviously, meaning, physicalism, if you will, and how do you get from physicalism to conscience and the ability to reason? To me, I think we've talked about this on a prior podcast, but I just go back to that idea that it seems to me that a mind is a very good explanation of that, an ultimate mind, if you will.
Yeah.
What do you think, Joel?
No, I like that. You're really drawing this back to an ontological foundation for intelligence. And I think it would end up looking a whole lot more like there's actually a God, a highest being that all intelligence and other forms of abstractions are grounded in, if we found a whole lot of life forms elsewhere in the universe who thought and communicated and, had consciousness in the same way that we do. I'll circle back to what I said before, where it wouldn't really bother me to discover intelligent alien life forms because, in the Bible, you already have intelligent moral agents outside of humanity in the form of angels. In a sense, they are alien creatures because they're not human. They're outside of humanity, but otherwise they, think and feel and make decisions and so forth. So, I never actually asked you, what are your thoughts on that response to the argument? The angel response.
No, I definitely think it's fascinating and very interesting. And it definitely, I think what you said shows that the Christian worldview allows for those types of beings to exist. And so it really kind of diffuses the argument, if you will, of, what if we found intelligent beings elsewhere in the universe, or outside of humanity, and we already know they exist. And so that kind of diffuses, I think, the argument.
Yeah, and again, I mean, you're talking about these intelligent alien life forms, and you have the mind-body problem coming up again, because either your brain creates intelligence or it receives intelligence. If a brain were to evolve in an environment other than ours, and brains create intelligence, then you would not be able in any way to expect them to be like our brains. But if brains receive intelligence, receive consciousness, then it's all probable that they might behave and think like we do, right?
Yeah, very much so. I think that's well said, and I also would want to add that just for me, to go back to kind of the famed, so that the listener feels the weight of this problem, if you go back to that argument from reason that people like C.S. Lewis and many of our precept friends would use. C.S. Lewis said this. He said, if the solar system was brought about by an accidental collision, then the appearance of organic life on this planet was also an accident, and the whole evolution of man was an accident too. If so, then all of our thought processes are mere accidents, the accidental byproduct of the movement of atoms. And this holds for the materialists and the astronomers as well as for anyone else's. But if their thoughts are merely accidental byproducts, why should we believe them to be true? I see no reason for believing that one accident should be able to give a correct account of all the other accidents. And so the point is that if we don't have this ultimate mind, or we could say, kind of piggybacking on what you just said, this conscience-giving being, then we don't even, in my view, have any ontological reasons for trusting our own ability to reason. So even if we came to the conclusion that extraterrestrial life existed, on materialism or naturalism, we wouldn't even have good reason to believe our own conclusions about that. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And I love that you pulled that quote out.
Yeah.
You're the best. All right. So essentially, I'm highlighting this intuition that we have, that we know that self-awareness, morality, and intelligence is a specific, unique, and special kind of thing. That is, that it's the highest state of being, because it's ultimately what we're looking for. In fact, expecting from, quote, developed alien life forms. Highly developed alien life forms. You look at science fiction, we fully expect the next time we see an alien for the aliens to have better technology than we do. But if it's the highest state of being, what grounds the state of being ontologically? And that swings us back around to, it's an intuition. We have an intuition that there's an ontological grounding for an abstract that we call intelligence or consciousness, or, hey, even conscience. So, this intuition is what I'm getting at. We know it's out there. It's at the root and core of our thought, and it's hard to think of an alien being that's actually alien in the technical sense.
Yeah, I think with the information you've shared, I completely agree with that. It's hard to think of alien in the sense that we understand it in our popular science fiction notion versus alien. It's hard to imagine an alien being that way. It would be, if I'm understanding you correctly, and the experts that you've cited, the being would be a lot more like us than not. Yeah. Am I correct in saying that, Joel?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the speculation. Obviously, it's all speculation. But honestly, this bringing us back around to the original argument that Tyler and I discussed in that other podcast, it only becomes a problem for Christianity. For that argument to work, for this argument to work that, the existence of intelligent aliens would be a problem. This only works if they're intelligent and moral in the same way that we are intelligent and moral. And if they are, then there has to be some higher grounding for that. It's like when you hear an atheist say that, well, the primitives who wrote the Bible were less morally advanced than we are. We're at a higher state of ethics and morality at this point. Yeah, so if we're at a higher state, then there must be some ultimate state that we're developing toward. Where's that state coming from, right?
Wow. Yeah. I like that point. I like that point. Where is that ultimate state that we seem to be striving toward? That's a good point, Joel. I like that's definitely something to consider.
Yeah, honestly, if you think about it, that also appeals to this whole intelligence idea, because you have people who are getting, quote, smarter. You learn more and you get smarter. And, we don't think of intelligence necessarily in just the ability to memorize and spit back facts. You'll find a person who does that, and they may seem intelligent, but then they can't tie their shoes or do their taxes. And, this idea of them being intelligent kind of goes out the window. Intelligence is much more complicated than just that. At some level, intelligence has this creative aspect in it. It has the idea of original thinking, of being able to go into a situation and dominate that situation through pure analytical and intuitive capacities, So ultimately, we've had such a difficult time defining or narrowing down the concept of intelligence. Could it possibly be that the reason we have such a difficult time with that is that intelligence is this aspect that's abstract and a little bit beyond our ability to, nail down or comprehend? It comes from some higher source of intelligence, right?
Right. You mentioned, we mentioned ultimate source. I mean, could there be an ultimate, if you will, or one might say a maximally great source of intelligence? And it does seem to me to ring true in that regard.
So, yeah, I mean, you have God as being omniscient. He knows everything. But then you have God as being all-wise. And those two things aren't the same. There's this sort of metaphysical or kind of a New Agey idea of the Coptic manuscripts. Have you heard of this at all? So the idea behind the Coptic manuscripts is this, that there is this sort of universal source of wisdom or knowledge that exists. All knowledge, everything that could be known or thought, is somehow gathered in this sort of wellspring or source together. And if you're able to tap into that in some degree, then your consciousness is just kind of blown out of your head and you have access to all wisdom, all knowledge.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So,
yes, absolutely. That sounds to me somewhat like might fall into the category of Reiki, for example. Reiki has that idea behind it that yes. So yes, I'm following you.
Okay. So yeah, you've got that, but then God isn't just omniscient. He's all-wise, meaning that he doesn't just know everything. He's capable of creative thought, of original thought. He can think new things that ain't been thunk before. And he's not just knowing everything. He's able to do everything. So again, in intelligence, you got to nail it down. There's more to intelligence than just knowing facts. It's the ability to use and manipulate those facts and to have creative or original thought. So there's a whole lot to intelligence, and all of that is kind of reflected in the nature of God. When a person is intelligent, it's just a dim shadow or reflection of this much greater capacity that God has, this ultimate capacity he has, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that completely.
All right, well, enough of that. Chad, you're going to give all those preachers out there that are listening to us something to think about, right?
Yeah, indeed. One of the passions of mine, because of how I became a Christian, I became a Christian through one of the things that was instrumental in me becoming a Christian was apologetics.
Right.
And the pastor that I was sitting under challenged the congregation, not just me personally, but the congregation. Basically he spoke to the skeptics or the unbelievers that were in the audience, and one of the things he said is look into the evidence. People have tried to disprove Christianity and have walked away from it believing it or impressed with the evidence, and so I encourage you to do the same. And so I began to do that, and and I began to do that, and I was very impressed with the evidence. And God definitely used it to draw me to a saving knowledge of him. Now, what was interesting, though, is when I returned to my church and was very excited about a lot of this evidence, that it was very clear to me that most believers did not have any type of background in it. They weren't familiar with it. They weren't interested in it. And that struck me as odd, especially the more and more I read the Bible and I saw how evidential the Bible was, and people like Paul and Peter and Stephen and Jesus himself, engaging in intelligent conversations and offering evidence, if you will. I found it really strange that it didn't seem that Christians were interested in this kind of thing. And then the longer I was a Christian, the more I noticed how many pastors did not value apologetics. Have you experienced that at all, Joel?
Yeah. I mean, I have sat under one minister for the largest part of my adult life, so I'm not saying that he doesn't appreciate apologetics, because I've had brief conversations about it, but you don't see it in the sermons. I mean, he's pulling a passage from Scripture, and then he's giving sort of the Bible commentary on that passage, and that's the method of preaching. Other ministers I've seen do more of a kind of a self-help type sermon where, they're just briefly touching on scriptures to teach you why, you should take your smartphone away from your kid, or something like that. But, they feel as if the people they're talking to are already on board. They're, preaching to the choir, sometimes literally, as it were. And so this idea that, you have to defend what you're speaking about just doesn't play in. Now, I'll say this. Whenever I make any kind of statement theologically or biblically or try to like make any kind of point whatsoever because of my background and work that I've done now for all these years. I always assume the skeptical mindset when I'm talking to the person. You know, I begin with this idea that they don't necessarily believe anything that I'm saying, and so I have to set it up with kind of a defense about what I'm saying as I'm saying it. Right, Chad?
Yeah, essentially what you're saying is you have to offer an apologetic for apologetics. And that is definitely something I think a lot of apologists find themselves having to do. The fallacy in that, and the concern that I have, is that we have so many parishioners who, they live in the world, they rub shoulders with people at the water cooler, if you will, and they have real conversations about real things happening in the real world. And unfortunately, a lot of pastors, I think, and I don't want to beat up on pastors. I mean, obviously, as I said, I had a pastor who challenged me to look into the evidence. And so I know that there are many pastors out there who do value apologetics, but I think we've got a long way to go in that area. And one of the struggles I have is that a number of pastors just don't see the need for it. And you mentioned something that really rang true to me. One of the things that fascinated me when I first became a Christian, a couple years after becoming a Christian, was that there were so many times where a pastor would just get up and just preach the message from the Bible to a rather large audience, and just assuming that everybody already believed the Bible.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was so strange because of the widespread skepticism that we have surrounding the Bible. And not only that, not only the widespread skepticism, but I think it's very normal when you're walking with the Lord to run into questions yourself and to have struggles with difficult issues, Old Testament ethics, if you will, or understanding how God can be, one nature in three persons and things like that. And I just didn't see pastors, enough pastors for my money, addressing that. And so what I wanted to do is I want to start out sharing a quote from Dayton Hartman. Dayton Hartman is the lead pastor at Redeemer Church in Rocky Mountain, North Carolina, and he's an old friend of mine. He's also an adjunct professor for a number of schools. Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary is one of them, and he's actually, as I said, a pastor, and so he kind of can see this from the pulpit, if you will. This isn't an apologist beating up on pastors, but this is a pastor, and he wrote this, and it's a bit of a lengthy quote, but it's from his book Church History for Modern Ministry, and he says this. He says, quote, "Apologetics may seem to fall outside the context of corporate worship, since many consider it part of personal evangelism. However, when the church gathers to worship through word and song, this time is for the instruction and edification of the saints. We cannot expect that congregants are not influenced by our culture or that they do not battle with doubt. When the people of God gather together, they do so to have their confidence in God's word confirmed and strengthened. Moreover, regardless of whether we recognize it, most Christians adopt their pastor's interpretation and application of Scripture as their own. Therefore, if we model an apologetic-free approach to the biblical text, that is what our people will practice. If pastors assume that their listeners know the foundation of a Christian truth claim, like Christ's deity, their congregations never see those claims unpacked so that they too can defend them and build on them. We should not assume that our congregation is in agreement with whatever scriptural propositional claim we are addressing. Thus, in an effort to edify and build up the body of Christ, we must contend earnestly for the faith from the pulpit, so that the pew will be a place of confidence and a place of preparation for cultural engagement. End quote. What do you think of that? What do you think of that quote, Joel?
I really like that quote, and
yeah.
It speaks to me as a teacher of something that they tell you. It's another teaching strategy where you meet the student where they're at. So you take the thing that you're teaching and you bring it around and connect it to something in the student's life. And I mean, you can see churches kind of do this intuitively, so they'll say, you ever feel this feeling in your heart that blah, 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 or, when you get down and you're praying to get, so they'll do that intuitively, but they completely miss the intellectual side of things. So when I'm, say, making a point on this podcast or in an article that I write, and I touch on, philosophy or science or scholarship or something that's real world, so to speak, it's not just theology. It connects it with some other field, and you start drawing those lines of connection and building a web where, with the Bible sitting at the middle and the strands of the web coming out and touching every other part of reality and life, Christianity doesn't just become this thing you do on the weekend. It becomes a worldview because it encompasses the world that we're in, and I missed out on that growing up in a really strict Christian environment. I don't mean strict rule-wise. I mean, there wasn't much else that around me that wasn't Christian. And, I come out of that environment into the real world, and nothing I grew up with really connected to the things I'm running into in the real world, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that is exactly what Dayton is saying here. Pastor Hartman is saying. He's saying that, we've got to be preparing our congregations, to contend for the faith, and they've got to see us doing it. They've got to model it. And so, of course, the question follows from that, well, how do we do that? If you're a pastor listening, or if you're someone like me who sometimes, fills in for area pastors, you might not necessarily be a pastor. What are some ways that you can put apologetics into your preaching in an effective way? I think it's important, too, Joel, to remember that the pastors are very overwhelmed in a lot of cases. They are doing, they're doing the marrying, they're doing the burying, they're doing the counseling, and all the while they are trying to have a family. They are preparing sermons, and so they have a lot on them. But whether or not pastors realize it or not, they're already an apologist. It's just a question of what kind of apologist are they going to be. Are they going to be an effective apologist or not? It's just like every pastor's a theologian, but what kind of theologian are they going to be? And so I just want to offer 5 what I think are very feasible ways to add apologetics into your sermon. And the first one is make sure that when you're introducing a book of the Bible, or if you're doing a series on a book of the Bible, discuss authorship. So in other words, take the time to explain to your congregation some of the reasons why the church believes, the historic church believes, that the listed author actually wrote the book. I remember once I was preaching on the book of Philippians, and through reading about Philippians, I had read a paper that Dan Wallace, New Testament scholar Dan Wallace, had written on it, and he had mentioned that among New Testament scholars, it is virtually unanimous that Paul wrote this book. And I put that into my sermon in an effort to give confidence to the congregation that, hey, this really is a letter from a historical person named the Apostle Paul. And furthermore, I would say that if you're preaching from a book in which the authorship is unsure of or undecided, say Hebrews, for example, don't be afraid to explain that and to spell out the history behind that. And then when one of your parishioners happens to hear an overblown claim, such as many of the ones that, for example, Bart Ehrman makes, then they're not going to be blindsided, but they're going to be informed, and they're going to be equipped to stand firm, and they're not going to be shaken. And that's one of the things about Bart Ehrman. He never should have been so successful, or he never would have been so successful had the church been doing things like this from the get-go, and we've kind of gotten away from our intellectual history, as J.P. Moreland explains in Loving God with All of Your Mind, and we have gotten into this touchy-feely kind of Christianity. But we are, I think, seeing a renaissance in apologetics, which I'm excited about. Having said all that, though, if we had been, from the preaching, and explaining these authorship issues, then Bart Ehrman wouldn't have been nearly as successful. And so the first one is discuss authorship. What do you think of that, Joel?
Well, I really like what you're saying here because honestly, if you come out of a, let's say, highly conservative, because I'm not sure throwing the word fundamentalist out there is going to do much value here, but a highly conservative Christian environment, the pastor isn't going to get up there and say, well, this book is definitely written by Paul because, he doesn't, I guess, want to get into all that. He just wants to pull the nuggets of truth out there and disperse them to the audience. But, when somebody gets out there and encounters this scholarship that says, hey, these 3 books probably weren't written by Paul, that's what scholars think or so forth, and they had no idea that was even a thing until they stepped out on the street from church, then church starts to seem pretty useless because it isn't giving, it's giving them this framework built on something that would otherwise seem kind of shaky if you looked into it. And so, yeah, I like this idea that you get up there and you say that, most scholars agree that this book was written by Paul. And then, when you're reading from, say, 2 Timothy or something like that, you could, preempt this by saying that some scholars think that this book was not written by Paul. And, ultimately what I do when I talk about authorship of these books, especially like the Gospels, I swing back around and I'm like, as long as we can be fairly confident that the words contained in here came from an eyewitness at some point down the line, then we can still be confident of the content of this book. What we want to try to disperse is this idea that it's completely made up, that there was no eyewitness behind that. These words were just being written by some dude out there. As long as we know that these words were transmitted ultimately by an eyewitness, then we're still confident. That can, impact these people that have this idea of inerrancy that basically says that, God pretty much just sat down and wrote this thing, right? When you have to kind of shoehorn in this idea that maybe, the people wrote it and God just sort of guided it in some sense, in some distant sense. You have to really kind of, pound this idea that this was a person writing this. Does that mean that these words aren't true in the sense that they hold theological certainty? No. But you have to understand this was written by a person. People to people to people. Right, Chad?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you bring up a great point. I agree with you completely that even if we didn't know precisely for who a certain author was of a gospel, it doesn't mean that we don't have a good, sound eyewitness account, especially if we have internal and external reasons to accept it. And I think that's a great point. And I was thinking too of my current pastor. We recently started a series on Revelation. And he started one of his sermons arguing for the traditional authorship. And it was definitely less than 10 minutes. And essentially what he did is he got up there and he said, there are some people that don't accept that, John was the author of the book. Here are some of their reasons. I'm going to argue that he was, and here are my reasons. And so is it possible that John wasn't the author? Sure, it's possible. But is it very reasonable to say that he probably was? Yeah, I think it is. And that was it. And he moved on. And so he gave us a couple good kind of summative arguments of some exegetical reasons and historical reasons as to why he thought we had good reason to believe. And then he moved on. It wasn't his whole sermon, and that's not what I'm suggesting. It was just enough to say, hey, we've got some good reasons to actually believe, like you're saying, either this was an eyewitness account, or that traditional authorship is correct, and here you go. And one of the resources that has really helped me is they have the Christian Apologetics Study Bible, and then they have the Christian Apologetics Study Bible for students. And either one of those resources, I've especially found the Christian Apologetics Study Bible helpful for this. It actually typically goes through this. It will say, here's the traditional author, here are some of the arguments that are raised against traditional authorship, but here's why we think you have good reason to trust in traditional authorship. And so it's really right there for the time-pressed pastor who doesn't have time to really dig into these issues. Even just sharing little nuggets from a resource like that would be extremely helpful. Are there any resources you could think of, Joel, that might be helpful for a pastor for this issue?
That's a interesting question. I think that possibly I'm going to circle around and do the one I always do, that the latest version of the evidence that demands a verdict, only because it's such a comprehensive catalog of the various apologetics arguments and so forth that it really hits all the nails on the head. And, honestly, you could use it almost as a Bible commentary as you're preparing for your sermon. Go to the book that it's addressing, or the issue it's addressing in a particular book of the Bible, and, look at some of the apologetics behind it and give your audience some confidence behind what you're saying. So I like what you're saying, because you could easily set up your sermon saying, okay, today I'm going to be talking about the book of, say, 2 Kings. And then you could, rattle off a couple of archaeological facts. And honestly, that kind of thing might draw your audience in when I think about it. Say archaeology has discovered X, Y, Z, that shows that King Uzziah or whoever was in evidence in history. It isn't just in these words, it's elsewhere. There's collaboration on this, or corroboration, sorry, on this king. And then, start your sermon. And that way the audience can feel comfortable in what you're saying, because you've started off by, connecting, again, my point, connecting the sermon to something in, reality, so to speak, right?
Yeah, and actually that's funny you said that, because another one of my points is to share archaeology. If you're preaching from a text that includes, for example, the synagogue in Capernaum, show a picture of that location to your congregation. It serves to ground the passage in reality. It helps the listener picture the historical event that occurred there that you're going to be talking about. And not only that, as Joel said, it would really, kind of draw the attention in of your listeners. And I think that again, is just a very easy way to incorporate apologetics into your preaching. I even think of I preach at our local rescue mission sometimes. And I've shared with them before, when I preach from the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, that historian Colin Hemmer, he has identified 84 facts in the last 16 chapters of the book of Acts that have been confirmed either by historical or archaeological research. And you can see as these men are sitting there and they're listening to me, when I share things like that, it gets their attention, because they have to sit in there 5 nights a week and they have to listen to someone preach before they're allowed to get their meal. And they hear speakers of all stripes. In other words, they have Catholic people coming in there, Catholic priests coming in there. They hear pastors of all different denominations. I don't know how many times when I've shared an apologetic theme message that I've had people come up to me and just be so appreciative of, wow, people don't talk about that stuff here. When people come in here and preach, they just keep telling us we're going to hell. They never give us any reasons to actually believe this is true. And so not only do you discuss authorship, not only do you share archaeology, but when you're incorporating apologetics into your messages, people appreciate it. They're hungry for it. And I think most pastors would find how appreciative their congregations are when they do this. Joel, have you ever had any experiences like that where you've shared apologetics and people have been appreciative of it?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to kind of hit them out of the blue to some extent. Like, whoa, how, I mean, almost to an extent, they seem blown away by this idea that maybe there are some people out there who didn't believe it. I think, at least in the Christian circles I travel in, you largely have this two-tiered structure in people's minds. You're either a Christian or you're a heretic, one of the two. And so, or an infidel, I guess is a better word for that. You're a Christian or you're an infidel. And so, they expect all Christians to be fully in their camp, believe everything they believe with no questions asked. And then, the heretics are the ones that just haven't heard it yet, right? So one thing I wanted to jump in on there real quick is I would like this idea of inoculating the listening audience by, presenting them with some of the counter arguments that they might encounter here. So, like, I don't know, say King David, you're talking about the book of 2 Samuel, and you would say that now there are skeptics that say that this is historically inaccurate because there's no evidence that King David existed. And then you say, well, but recently there's this archaeological find that, says the name King David on it and so forth. So, it's this counter-argument thing where you talk them through some of the objections they might find to this, and then you address those objections. Yeah, I mean, you see, what is it, the interlocutor Apostle Paul uses when he predicts a counter-argument that he might receive to something he's saying, and then he responds to that counter-argument. I think that's a good technique because it inoculates the audience against some of these arguments they might otherwise find out there that are not going to blow them away because you've already told them about this argument.
Right. I agree completely. Yeah, and that's definitely right along the lines of sharing that archaeology, but not only that, but then preparing them for, well, some people say this, but look at this. And it really serves to undermine or take the sting, let me say, out of the claim. And people don't end up looking like a deer in the headlights when somebody brings something like that up. But after they're under this preaching for a number of years, they begin to model the practice that their pastor has shown them, and they begin to be able to think about these issues and respond to them thoughtfully and not panic. And so I think that's a great strategy. So far we've talked about discuss authorship, share archaeology. Another thing that pastors can do is offer a resource. And what I mean by that is when a pastor is preaching, it is impossible for them to have time to discuss every issue they address exhaustively. I know that when I've been speaking, there have been times when issues come up and I've dealt with it, but I have a lot more to say, but for the sake of time, I can't continue down that road. And so it can be helpful to offer resources to the congregation for the listener in your congregation who wants to learn more about a given topic. And so one that comes to mind is if you're preaching from an Old Testament passage and you come across a difficult passage involving Old Testament ethics, which is a really popular kind of objection these days, yeah. Offer a resource such as, David Lamb's God Behaving Badly, or Paul Copan's Is God a Moral Monster? These resources will allow those in your congregation who struggle with such matters, that will put resources in their hands so they're able to seek answers to their questions. And so you don't have to feel like, as a pastor, well, I can't take on apologetics because I can't conceivably answer all of these objections. Well, sure. No, none of us can. You don't have to answer you don't have to have all the answers. You just need to know where to find them. Right. You just need to know where to direct people who have them. And so offering an article, a book, a podcast, or something like that to the intellectually curious or to the Christian who is striving to obey that command to love God with all their mind is a very easy, efficient way to incorporate apologetics into your preaching. And even if you use a PowerPoint, you can put a picture of the book or the resource that you're talking about up on the PowerPoint and share it so that they can get a look at what it is they're actually going to be using, or what they'll look up on Amazon and whatnot. And so I think offering a resource is another great way to incorporate apologetics into the preaching, and it doesn't take a lot of work. What do you think, Joel?
Well, I like that. And honestly, most churches I've gone to have some kind of church library that include books. So I honestly think that you don't hear these resources offered, and it seems like it would cost practically nothing to do that because the church already has these resources in their library, and you could just tell the congregant to, hey, we have this in our library, you check it out, it'll give you these answers. So, I really like that. One thing that I would add is for churches to seek out resources that are written at a variety of comprehension levels because, Paul Copan, great writer, but some of his stuff is a little heavy, and you'd want to try to get some version of that broken down in a way that the audience, it's easier for a person to read. Again, we bring him up about 5 times a podcast, but J. Warner Wallace did a decent job with these kinds of defenses and writes in such a way that it's a little easier for somebody who's not already, got a bachelor's degree or so forth to sit down and read it. So yeah, I mean, offer the resources, make sure there's a variety of resources that hit different comprehension levels.
I think that's a good word, and it's interesting you said that because I purposely picked David Lamb's God Behaving Badly because it is a much more layman-level, readable attempt to explain some of those Old Testament passages, whereas, as you said, Paul Copan's is very technical, and sometimes his answers can be difficult, especially for somebody who's just coming to these issues. And so, yeah, I think that's a great point. And thankfully, we do have people like J. Warner Wallace or Lee Strobel or Sean McDowell who write in such a way that are very understandable. And then we have our more technical philosophers such as Copan or William Lane Craig or someone like that. So that's a great point. So we've got discuss authorship, share archaeology, offer a resource, also share an argument. And what I mean, and we've kind of addressed this, Joel, but share an argument. And what I mean by that is when you're preaching, don't be afraid to share an argument for the existence of God or the reliability of the Bible. Some of these arguments can be given in really short, memorable ways. So, for example, if you're the cosmological argument, the argument for God based on the existence of the cosmos, or the moral argument, if there is no God, there is no morality. You think of these, I think of Greg Kokel, he's so funny. So the cosmological argument, as I said, basically says the argument for God based on the existence of the cosmos. Well, he sums it up as the Big Bang needs a Big Banger. Or the teleological argument, the argument for God based on the design of the cosmos, he sums it up as design needs a designer. Even putting phrases like these, or the moral argument, moral law requires a moral lawgiver. Even putting phrases like this in your preaching, they don't have to be necessarily sophisticated, drawn-out arguments, although I'm not opposed to that. Even putting phrases in there like this give people a feasible way, an understandable way to understand the basic concepts of some of the more technical arguments for God's existence. And so don't be afraid to share an argument for the existence of God or the reliability of the Bible. And it affirms, as Dayton said in his quote, it affirms the faith of your congregation, and it could possibly challenge somebody who's there and who's skeptical and draw them in. And so I think sharing an argument in a nice, concise way, or even through a quote, would be a great way to incorporate apologetics into your preaching. What do you think of that one, Joel?
Yeah, absolutely. Sharing the arguments, it's good. And, I like that you're, thinking about boiling them down into easy to learn quotes. I think that Ravi Zacharias was always good with that. And Frank Turk does a decent job with that as well. So there are, models to follow when it comes to giving these arguments, but making them something that are easy to pick up, easy to understand. And, Ravi and Turk both do a good job of kind of building the system, where they lay out 3 points that are very easy to follow and are very easy to memorize and comprehend, so that down the road you've got them as a resource to bring back up. And so, yeah, you've got role models out there that already do a good job at this if you're willing to, check them out.
Yeah, I would agree. Frank Turek is very good of having little sound bites that are very memorable and helpful, and even help you just memorize or remember the arguments too. But they're also good little zingers to throw out in conversations sometimes. So we've got discuss authorship, we've got share archaeology, offer a resource, share an argument. The final one is to share a video clip. And we've got ministries such as Stand to Reason, the 1 Minute Apologist, and they offer short video clips with credible answers to some of the most difficult questions out there aimed toward Christianity. And these videos easily can be incorporated into your sermons. And I've done this in the past. I did a sermon on the moral argument once, and I tied the moral argument into the gospel. And I was trying to help the congregation understand, as I was planning, I was thinking about how can I get the congregation to understand that the source of the moral law has to be something outside of humanity. And I really wanted to provide something that really stuck. And I found this short little video that was probably 4 minutes long from Peter Kreeft, the philosopher Peter Kreeft, that really just explained. It was definitely an argument to the best explanation. Here are all these possibilities of where the moral law came from. Here's why it can't be these possibilities, and here's why it needs to be something outside of mankind. And it took 4 minutes of the sermon, but man, did it nail the point better than I ever could. And so I think sharing these videos is another great way to put apologetics into your sermons. And not only that, but sharing these videos is another medium to kind of suck people in. As you're talking about with archaeology, this would be another way to get somebody's attention, maybe even showing a video in the beginning and then not even and being a bit ambiguous about it and letting them wonder, I wonder why he's putting that up there. Or saying, one objection you hear when you talk about this issue is, and you share the objection and say, well, we're going to listen to Greg Kokel of Stand to Reason answer that, and then share the clip. These are just a few ways, that's just one way in a few ministries, if you will, that you can use to kind of incorporate apologetics into your preaching, and it requires very little work on your part. What do you think, Joel?
Yeah, I like that. And, the very little work, especially in a golden age now of apologetics. You've got so many video resources being created for free online, so you could search practically any question and look for it in YouTube, and you're going to get 50 videos featuring debates or talks, or just a YouTuber apologist that comes on and explains it with some animations or so forth. And I understand that that William Lane Craig's ministry, Reasonable Faith, has been putting out an animated series now for various apologetics uses. So, you've got a buffet out there to draw from for these things. So it's very easy to find something that fits the point in the sermon that you're trying to make.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And those animated videos you brought up from William and Craig are absolutely outstanding. And they are on arguments for the existence of God. They address the problem of evil. They address who did Jesus think he was, the absurdity of life without God, topics that, really, and again, topics that really tie into the core of what Christianity is, but also they're presented in such a way that they're very engaging and they're very precise. But again, they're only 4 or 5 minutes long. So pastors who are worried about how do I fit this in, we're not talking about a tremendous amount of time. It doesn't take a lot of time to put literally the 1 minute apologist. Most of those videos are 1 to 3 minutes. And so we're not talking about a tremendous amount of time either, Joel.
Yeah, and I suppose this is the time to insert that the Mentionables are now doing YouTube video series on apologetics and answering questions and so forth. So, if you're listening to this podcast, we've got some resources coming out now too.
Yeah, exactly. And so take advantage of those as well. And so in summary, I've worked closely with pastors, and I understand that time is so important. And these things that I've offered, discussing authorship, sharing archaeology, offering a resource, sharing an argument, sharing a video clip, many of them I came up with the mindset of, hey, this is a pastor who, again, is doing the marrying, the burying, and the counseling, and preparing sermons, and has a family. And so I want you to understand that they are they're reasonable as far as the time that you have. And so I would encourage you just to try to begin to incorporate even one of these things in a sermon, maybe once a month. And I think you'll be surprised at the response that you get from the congregation.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. I haven't experienced it, but I could imagine that. And honestly, this goes back to a point that I brought up in my book, that the primary audience for apologetics is not an atheist, it's a Christian, because you've got Christians that are looking for reasons that their faith is so. I mean, I suppose to some extent the atheist criticism of Christianity is true in that, a lot of people believe because they were told so. Their pastor told them so. And
Agreed.
When they walk out into the world and somebody tells them it's not so, they don't have that structure and foundation they need to defend it. All they've got is to point back to the pastor and say, well, that guy told me it was so. And I understand that we're coming out of a, background where the nation was sort of more or less founded by Christians and built by Christians, and everybody was a Christian. And, if we talked about a dictator, the biggest insult we could think of was that they are godless, and the good upstanding man in the community is a God-fearing man. So that's the background we come out of. We're very much removed from that background now. But I think that the modern church is still kind of stuck in that background, not realizing that Christianity is no longer the default that everybody agrees on. And to an extent, it's a good thing that people are forced to look into the faith they hold and try to discover the reasons for that faith. And now that we are in a post-Christian culture, it behooves the pastor to actually address those things. They're no longer taken for granted.
Yeah, I agree completely, Joel, and that was one of the things I used to say to my wife when I would share with her my frustrations about not hearing a lot of these types of arguments and evidences come over the pulpit is, it's almost like a lot of people are just assuming that everybody in the congregation agrees and holds to all the essential truths, or holds that the Bible is even reliable, where that's not the case anymore. And so we can't keep, and then what I hear you saying is we can't keep pretending that it is. At one time it was, but it's no longer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, and we need to realize that. And even if the audience at the church does buy that everything we're saying is, pure golden gilded truth, they should at least be made aware of the fact that their neighbor or the guy they're rubbing shoulders with at work probably doesn't believe that. And so here's why it is true. Here's the foundation for your belief. And you mentioned earlier, and you've mentioned this before, that this is actually how the apostles and Jesus taught. They didn't walk in and say, that, hey, everybody agrees with me here, so this is the truth I'm giving to you. No, for the most part, they were speaking to a hostile audience. So they always began their speech by, this is why you should believe this, and then, follow with the truth. The appetizer was reasons to believe, and the main course was building on those things, the truth that we get out of it.
Yes, very absolutely correct. And in closing this topic, I want to share something from the book of Titus. I remember once I was sitting with a pastor, and I was sharing with him some of the things I share here on the podcast, and just basically trying to get an answer to that question of why don't more pastors see apologetics as essential? And he looked at me and he said, Chad, he said, I get it. Apologetics is important and whatnot. He said, but I'm dealing on a daily basis with marriages that are failing, with families that are falling apart. And I remember walking out of his office, and at the time, I really didn't have a good response to that. I didn't know what to make of it. I thought, well, I guess I see his point. And then I was reading in the book of Titus, and in Titus 1, Paul is writing here, and he's talking about the qualifications of elders. And even if we're not an elder, if you will, in the church, I think we would all agree that as growing Christians, we want to at least grow toward having the qualities of an elder, even if we're not technically an elder. And Paul writes this. He says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Namely, if any man is above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dispensation or rebellion. For the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine." And he goes on here, and he explains here, he says, "holding fast the faithful word which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able to both exhort in sound doctrine and refute those who contradict." Then he says, "For there are many rebellious men, empty talkers, and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision." Now listen to this, Joel, "who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families, teaching things they should not teach for the sake of sordid gain." Now here's my point. Am I saying apologetics fixes every problem? No, absolutely not. But what does Paul tell us here? He says that these rebellious men who were empty talkers, they were deceivers. He says they were teaching things that they should not teach. And what was that doing? It was destroying or upsetting entire families. And so what I have seen this myself happen. I remember once I was doing a Bible study, and a lady came in. She explained to us how she and her husband were raising their son together as Christians, and he had fallen into the internet infidel community. He had fallen into the John Loftus debunking Christianity, all that and the like. And interestingly, he fell away from his faith. He insisted his son be pulled out of Christian school, and their marriage became very strained and difficult over this. And all because if he had been prepared, he wouldn't have stumbled. And that was a perfect example. And so my point is, long and short, apologetics does not solve any problem, but apologetics is much more practical than we'd ever imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think that honestly, apologetics and evangelism, if you go back to classic Christianity, even as far back as the apostles, they've always been coupled. You give the reason why you should believe, and then you tell them what you should believe. If they don't have that foundation of reason, they're not going to buy the what unless they know the how. So, and the fact that apologetics got decoupled from evangelism is a tragedy that is now coming down to roost in the West.
Agreed. Well said. Well, I think we have a question of the week to talk about, don't we?
Well, we got a question, all right. This is from a question addressing a previous podcast. This is listener mail for the podcast, and this one is from Zach, who writes, "In your recent podcast, you mentioned the way that many very different people attempt to appropriate Jesus to their own camp. Do you see that as fundamentally different from the way that people today appropriate Martin Luther King Jr., JFK, or the American Founding Fathers? It seems rather to me that it is more extensive with Jesus for two reasons. First, Jesus is a more culturally salient figure in that his appeal is far more wide-reaching. Second, the paltry amount of first-hand evidence we have about him, compared to more modern figures, makes it easier to put him into whatever historical box you find most appealing. Just curious what your thoughts might be on this. First, I got to apologize to Zach, because this question comes from months ago. It's at least a half a year old. But just the way the podcasts work, we haven't managed to get around to it till now. So Zach, if you're still listening, for your sake, Chad, this is a question that's referencing a podcast that Tyler and I did, where we talked about how everyone makes Jesus in their own image. So examples that we gave in that podcast were that Hindus think Jesus was a Hindu guru, Buddhists thinks that he was an ascended master, the LGBT community thinks he was gay, feminists think that there are some feminists that claim he was a woman, or at least a very strong feminist. Basically, everyone co-opts Jesus into their own ideological camp, and they do so almost universally. Thanks for the question, Zach. I'll address this, and I'll see what you think afterwards, Chad. I'm tapping into my psychology roots here, and I can tell you that once a person adopts a particular ideological stance, and when I say that, I'm talking about a broad worldview where they have some foundational beliefs that then connect to other beliefs to create a web of beliefs, so to speak. Anyway, once they adopt those, they try to cram everything they know into that stance, so that when a person runs across something like a founding father or JFK, they're going to identify those people as either friends, foe, or neutral. If they consider the person to be inside their own ideological camp, they're going to interpret all of the person's words and deeds through their particular ideological lens, so that whatever the person said or did, it can be worked in some ways to agree with them. And you'll see this with historical figures. For as far as Christianity goes, I guess I could throw out either Martin Luther or John Calvin. Luther was a fairly strong anti-Semite, and Calvin campaigned to have a few people burned at the stake, if I remember correctly. And so these are thrown in the face of Reformed theologians and so forth. And you'll see ones that'll actually try to step up and defend or explain away some of these actions because, hey, these guys are inside their ideological camp. So we can't believe that anything they ever thought or did was wrong in any sense. We got to defend them. And you'll see this happen a lot with, for instance, people who are big on the founding fathers will try to defend the slave owners among them and so forth. And honestly, again, this is ad hominem attacks because we're not so much concerned with what they did as the arguments that they made. But at any rate, they'll do the same thing in reverse. People will do the same thing in reverse if they've identified the person as a foe. They'll try to demonize them or find some reason to disagree with the person, and everything that person does has to be wrong somehow. And I can't think of any modern examples of that.
Yeah, right.
So a neutral stance basically allows someone to identify a person's words or deeds without making any sort of personal connection to them, which honestly is the way history should be done, but it is what it is. So this is just how the human mind works. It tries to cram the actions of people into pre-existing categories in order to give that person some identity in their mind. Broadly speaking, it's a generally effective way to quickly assimilate information and identify how it relates to others. That is, using what you know in order to give that person some kind of identity in your mind. It's, there's a lot of criticism about this, confirmation bias, deconfirmation bias, and so forth. But those kinds of things have served a function for, all of human history in your mind. It's a way to quickly identify things, a very intuitive way of thinking, so that you're able to navigate your way through situations very quickly by using what you already know to try to categorize new things you're running across. But when it comes to larger-than-life characters who have some kind of power or renown, there's a complicating factor that you want to relate that person's influence to your own ideas of truth. So, for instance, if you disagree with some kind of ideological stance, it helps your worldview to associate that thing with, say, the Nazis. Ever see this happen, Chad? You know, somebody labels somebody a Nazi because they disagree with them? Or is that just me?
Oh, no, absolutely. It's a very common tactic, especially in our current political climate, to pick a figure such as that from history and equate somebody with that person in order to make them look as bad as possible. But also many times it's a way of trying to shoot them down without actually having to deal with what they're saying. So, yeah, absolutely. I see that, Joel.
All right. And you have the same thing in reverse with, say, a character like Martin Luther King Jr., who was good. Everybody will agree. So if you can get him on your side, so to speak, you've added some street cred to your ideological stance. So in that respect, yes, it's basically the same thing with Jesus. People really want him on their side because it gives legitimacy to their worldview. The question isn't the psychological or rhetorical mechanism that makes people do that. The question is, why Jesus? Now, Zach, you suggested why you think it might be Jesus. You said that he's more culturally salient and his appeal is far more wide-reaching. Of course, I agree that he has a wide-reaching appeal. That was kind of my point in the podcast. We still need to ask why his appeal is so wide-reaching. You got a few factors here. One is that somehow a Jewish carpenter with a couple of followers was murdered by Romans who didn't like him after being accused by Jews who didn't like him, basically disqualifying him to be the Messiah all the disciples expected him to be. And yet, he's the most well-known figure in the world 2,000 years later. How did that happen? Also, if he's so appealing, why is it that religions are scrambling to adopt him, but atheists are scrambling to discredit him? So far as religions are concerned, you'd think they'd be interested in discrediting the competition. And why are atheists trying to ditch the historic Jesus and not, say, the historic Buddha or Muhammad? And clearly, Jesus can't be a Buddhist, a Hindu, a woman, and a gay man. Yet somehow all of these groups have molded whatever it is that he says and did to reflect their camp. This indicates to me, at least, that it isn't some kind of specific appeal he has to those groups so much as a more transcendent appeal. This kind of leads to your second point, that being that the scant historical sources allow for a broader interpretation of who and what he was. 2 points in response to that. Firstly, we have this historical evidence for Jesus. We have more of it than we do for Caesar, Alexander the Great, Plato, or Confucius. So other ancient characters whom we don't co-opt have no greater historical evidence. Jesus was somehow selected out of any number of ancient characters to get this special treatment. Secondly, let's talk about Christianity. Buddhism is an ancient religion that developed independently of Jesus, yet they lay claim to him. The same is true of Hinduism and Islam. Also, if you read back along the development of things like feminism and the LGBT movement and modern political parties, they may make casual reference to Jesus, but he's not the founding character of these movements. So Christianity is the only belief system that claims to have been started by Christ, and it is also the largest belief system in the world. 30% of people in the world are Christians. Did you know this, Chad? 1 in 3 people?
I have heard similar statistics, yes.
All right. Christianity is the only belief. Okay, so while you may argue all day about the ways in which modern Christianity agrees with or disagrees with Christ, every belief within those systems uses Christ as their primary referent. They don't claim that Christ agrees with them. They say that they are right or wrong insofar as their practices and beliefs agree with Christ. So that's my response to Zach. Chad, you have anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that my concern, I suppose, with the question is that it makes it as if, and you covered this, but I would want to reiterate it, that it makes it sound like that we have kind of scant evidence for the historical Jesus. And I think that if we were to, I think on a superficial level, it's very popular to say, but if we actually do some historical work and dig into the evidence that we have, that we actually have very good reasons to believe that the historical Jesus actually said the things that the Bible claims, that he actually claimed to be divine, that he actually performed exorcisms, and that he actually predicted his death and resurrection, and then, of course, ultimately was resurrected. And so I think that my only, I guess, rejoinder would be that I would want the listener to do a little more work as he looks into the historical Jesus. And a great place to start is a book off the top of my head, The Historical Jesus by Gary Habermas. And so I would just want to recommend that resource.
That's a good one. All right, let's close it down. A long time ago, I ran a podcast contest for a giveaway for the children's book project that the Mentionables did. So I'm going to announce the winner now.
Did I win?
Yeah, you might have. Let's see. Nope, it's Mikhail Kozenkov. He's our winner. Mikhail, send us your mailing address.
I knew he was going to win.
And info. I bet you did know he was going to win. Send us your mailing address and info. With that to you, Mikhail. All right, so time to close it down. Let's see. The Mentionables have a Facebook page where we post all of this stuff. It's the best way to follow us. Our Twitter feed is decent to follow because in addition to posting all of our updates and news and so forth on Twitter, we also provide other resources, posts from other apologists or articles that might be helpful on Twitter. So it's good to follow because it offers a lot of resources just beyond the stuff that the Mentionables do. The Mentionables have a YouTube channel, and as I mentioned earlier, we're in the process of producing videos. We're launching one every Thursday. For Mentionables TV, or MTV for short, because I don't want to confuse anybody, right, Chad?
Exactly. You don't, and we also don't want any lawsuits, Joel.
Yeah, no, we definitely wouldn't want that. So at any rate, there's the YouTube channel, and I'm very excited about that because we're rolling out a series right now where we're answering 15 questions that Christians can't answer, from a video titled Questions That Christians Can't Answer. So there's that. Our book, the signature project titled The Mentionables Project, is now available as an ebook through Kindle. And there's also, you can get the physical copy of that book through the Mentionables website, which is thementionables.org. Make sure you put the at the beginning, because mentionables.org is
very important.
Mentionables.org is a website you don't want in your browsing history, but thementionables.org is one you do want in your browsing history. So go there. We put out an article every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Wednesdays we do our Questions of the Week article where we answer your questions that you send in, and you get multiple answers from different members of the network. So that's pretty much it. We have now put on a donation button on our website. Any donations you might care to give will go towards funding the next conference that we do. And we're very close to setting the date for that conference, so we'll give you all the details of that as it comes out. All right, those were all the closing bits I had. Anything you want to say, Chad?
No, I think you covered it.
All
well
right.
done.
Well, everybody, keep on mentioning, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.